The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Kalarabad, a small village nestled between rolling hills in northern Afghanistan. Amina walked carefully along the narrow path, her worn sandals making soft sounds against the packed earth. At 19, she had learned to move quietly, to draw little attention to herself in a place where being noticed could mean trouble. She carried a small clay pot balanced on her hip, filled with water from the village well. The weight of it reminded her of the countless trips she had made since childhood, back and forth from her family's modest home to fetch water, gather firewood, or help her mother with the endless chores that filled their days. Life in Kalarabad followed ancient rhythms, unchanged for generations. The village sat under the control of Commander Rashid, a local warlord whose influence stretched across several districts. His men patrolled the streets daily, their weapons gleaming in the harsh sunlight, their eyes scanning for any sign of defiance or trouble. They collected taxes, settled disputes with swift and often brutal justice, and enforced rules that kept the population in line. Amina's father, Hassan, worked as a carpenter, crafting simple furniture and repairing homes damaged by the frequent storms that swept through the valley. Her mother, Fatima, tended to their small garden behind their house, growing vegetables and herbs that helped feed the family. They lived simply but with dignity, following the customs of their ancestors while trying to stay out of the way of those who held power. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Amina's younger brother, 12-year-old Omar, failed to return home from school. The small mud-brick schoolhouse sat at the edge of the village, where a dedicated teacher named Mr. Karimi taught the children basic reading and mathematics. Omar was bright and curious, always asking questions that sometimes made the adults uncomfortable. As the hours passed and darkness fell, Hassan and Fatima grew increasingly worried. Hassan walked the streets calling Omar's name, checking with neighbors and shopkeepers. No one had seen the boy since the afternoon. By midnight, panic had settled over the household like a heavy blanket. The next morning brought devastating news. Mr. Karimi arrived at their door, his face pale and his hands trembling. He explained that Omar had been caught by Commander Rashid's men while trying to retrieve a ball that had rolled into the compound where the commander stored weapons and supplies. The boy had simply climbed over the low wall to get his ball, not understanding the significance of the heavily guarded area. Commander Rashid viewed this as an act of spying. In his mind, no child wandered into his compound by accident. He believed Omar had been sent by someone, perhaps foreign agents or rival factions, to gather information about his operations. The commander's paranoia had grown over the years as various groups competed for control of the region's trade routes and resources. The punishment was swift and merciless. Omar was beaten severely and thrown into a dark cell beneath the commander's headquarters. Word spread through the village that he would be executed at dawn as an example to others who might consider betraying the commander's trust. Hassan fell to his knees when he heard the news, his strong carpenter's hands covering his face as sobs shook his body. Fatima screamed and tore at her closing grief, her cries echoing through their small home. Neighbors gathered, offering comfort but knowing there was little they could do against the commander's decree. Amina stood frozen in the doorway, watching her parents collapse under the weight of this tragedy. Her mind raced as she tried to think of something, anything that might save her brother's life. She had always been the practical one in the family, the one who found solutions when problems arose. But this seemed beyond any solution she could imagine. As night fell, Amina made a decision that would change her life forever. She could not stand by and watch her innocent brother die for a child's mistake. While her parents grieved, she wrapped herself in her darkest shawl and slipped out of the house, moving like a shadow through the empty streets toward Commander Rashid's compound. The guard posts were manned by sleepy sentries who paid little attention to a young woman moving carefully along the edges of buildings. Amina had grown up in these streets and knew every alley, every shortcut, every place where the shadows were deepest. She made her way to the back of the compound, where she had often seen servants coming and going through a small gate used for deliveries. Her heart pounded as she approached the gate, knowing that discovery would mean death for both her and Omar. She pressed herself against the mud-brick wall and listened for sounds from within. The compound was quiet, except for the occasional murmur of voices from the guard towers and the distant sound of someone chopping wood. Gathering her courage, Amina pushed gently on the wooden gate. To her surprise, it swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. She slipped inside, finding herself in a courtyard filled with stacked supplies and equipment. The moon was new, leaving the area in near-complete darkness, which worked in her favor. She moved carefully among the shadows, looking for any sign of where prisoners might be kept. The compound was larger than she had imagined, with several buildings connected by covered walkways. She could hear voices coming from the main building, where oil lamps flickered behind shuttered windows. After what felt like hours of careful exploration, she found a heavy wooden door set into the ground near the back wall of the compound. Iron bars covered a small opening at the top, and she could smell the dampness and filth that came from below. This had to be where they kept prisoners. Amina knelt beside the door and whispered her brother's name. For a long moment, there was no response. Then she heard a weak voice calling back to her from the darkness below. It was Omar, alive but clearly hurt and frightened. Through the bars she could barely make out his small form huddled in a corner of the underground cell. His voice was hoarse and broken as he told her what had happened. The guards had questioned him for hours, demanding to know who had sent him and what he had seen in the compound. When he insisted he was only trying to get his ball, they had beaten him with sticks and leather whips. Amina's anger burned hot in her chest as she listened to her brother's story. This was an innocent child who had never harmed anyone, whose only crime was chasing a ball into the wrong place at the wrong time. The injustice of it filled her with a rage she had never felt before. She tried to find a way to open the heavy door, but it was secured with multiple locks and iron bars that she could never break or move. Even if she could get Omar out, the guards would discover his escape long before they could get away from the village. Commander Rashid's men would hunt them down, and the punishment for helping a prisoner escape would be far worse than what Omar currently faced. As dawn approached, Amina realized she had only one option left. She would have to confront Commander Rashid directly and plead for her brother's life. It was dangerous beyond measure, but she could see no other way. She kissed her fingers and pressed them against the bars of Omar's cell, promising him that she would find a way to save him. The sun was beginning to rise as she made her way to the main building of the compound. Guards were changing shifts, and she could hear the sounds of people beginning their daily routines. She took a deep breath and walked directly to the main entrance, where two armed guards stood watch. When they saw her approaching, they raised their weapons and demanded to know her business. Amina lifted her chin and spoke with more confidence than she felt, telling them she needed to speak with Commander Rashid about her brother. The guards laughed at first, dismissing her as a foolish girl who didn't understand how things were. But Amina refused to leave. She stood there in the growing daylight, repeating her request to see the commander. Other guards gathered, curious about the young woman who dared to demand an audience with their leader. Eventually, word of her presence reached Commander Rashid himself. The commander was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and cold eyes that seemed to look right through people. He had built his power through a combination of cunning, brutality, and an ability to sense weakness in others. He ruled his territory with an iron fist, believing that mercy was a sign of weakness that would eventually lead to his downfall. When he emerged from his headquarters, flanked by armed bodyguards, Amina felt her courage begin to waver. This was the man who held the power of life and death over everyone in the region, who could order her killed with a simple nod of his head. But the thought of Omar alone in that dark cell gave her strength. Commander Rashid studied her for a long moment before speaking. His voice was quiet but carried an edge of menace that made everyone around him tense. He asked her why she thought she had the right to disturb him, why she believed her brother's life was worth his time and attention. Amina's response would set in motion a chain of events that would test her courage beyond anything she could imagine. Amina stood before Commander Rashid, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the compound as armed men formed a loose circle around them. She could feel her hands trembling, but she forced herself to speak clearly and directly. She told the commander that her brother was innocent, that he was just a child who had made a simple mistake. She explained how Omar had been playing with other children when their ball rolled into the compound, how he had climbed over the wall without thinking, driven only by a boy's desire to continue his game. She spoke of his character, his kindness, his dreams of becoming a teacher like Mr. Karimi. Commander Rashid listened without expression, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished speaking, silence stretched between them, like a taut rope. Several of his men shifted uncomfortably, glancing between their leader and the young woman who had dared to challenge his judgment. Finally, the commander spoke. His voice was calm but carried undertones of dangerous anger. He told Amina that her brother had violated the security of his compound, that in times of war such actions could not be overlooked regardless of the perpetrator's age. He explained that showing mercy to one would encourage others to test his authority, that his power depended on swift and decisive punishment for any transgression. But then he made an offer that chilled Amina to her core. He would spare Omar's life, but only if she took his place. The punishment meant for her brother would fall on her instead. She would receive 50 lashes in the village square at noon, administered in front of the entire population as a lesson about the consequences of defying his authority. The crowd that had gathered murmured at this unexpected turn. 50 lashes was a brutal punishment that could cripple or kill, especially when administered to someone as young and slight as Amina. Commander Rashid was known for his creative cruelties, but this seemed unusually harsh even by his standards. Amina felt her world spinning around her. She had hoped to appeal to whatever mercy might exist in the commander's heart, to convince him that Omar posed no threat and deserved forgiveness. Instead, she now faced a terrible choice between watching her brother die or accepting a punishment that might destroy her own life. She thought of Omar in that dark cell, probably listening to every word through the iron bars. She thought of her parents at home, already grieving for one child, and unaware that they might lose another. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. Commander Rashid seemed to enjoy her torment, his lips curving in what might have been a smile. He gave her 1 hour to decide, warning that if she refused his offer or tried to flee, both she and Omar would be executed immediately. He turned and walked back into his headquarters, leaving her standing in the courtyard surrounded by his men. The guards watched her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Some of them had sisters or daughters of their own, and they could see the agony of her choice written on her face. But none dared speak to her or offer comfort, knowing that Commander Rashid had ways of discovering such sympathies and punishing them severely. Amina walked slowly to the edge of the compound, her mind racing through possibilities and scenarios. Could she somehow escape with Omar? Could she appeal to higher authorities? Could she rally the villagers to stand against the commander? Each option seemed more impossible than the last. Commander Rashid controlled everything within a day's travel, and his network of informants made resistance nearly impossible. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, she made her way back to the underground cell where Omar waited. Her brother's face appeared at the barred opening, hope and fear warring in his young eyes. When she told him about the commander's offer, Omar began to cry, begging her not to sacrifice herself for his mistake. But Amina had already decided. She could not live with herself if she allowed her innocent brother to die, especially for such a trivial offense. She told Omar that she loved him, that their parents needed him more than they needed her, and that he must promise to take care of their family if something happened to her. Omar gripped the bars of his cell and pleaded with her to find another way, but Amina's mind was made up. She kissed her fingers and pressed them against his small hands one last time before walking back to find Commander Rashid. The commander was waiting in his office, a large room decorated with weapons and trophies from his various campaigns. Maps covered the walls, marking territories under his control and the locations of rival factions. He looked up from a stack of papers when she entered, as if he had never doubted what her decision would be. When Amina agreed to take her brother's place, Commander Rashid nodded with satisfaction. He called for his men to begin preparations for the public punishment, sending messengers throughout the village to announce what would happen at noon. Word spread quickly through Kalarabad, and people began to gather despite their fear and reluctance to witness such brutality. Hassan and Fatima learned of their daughter's decision from a neighbor who came running to their house with the news. Fatima collapsed to the floor in shock, while Hassan stood frozen, unable to comprehend that he might lose both his children in a single day. They rushed toward the commander's compound, desperate to intervene, but were turned away by guards who had orders to keep the family at a distance. The village square began to fill with reluctant spectators. Many covered their faces or turned away, unwilling to watch but afraid to leave and risk the commander's displeasure. Children were kept inside houses, shielded from the brutality their parents knew was coming. At exactly noon, Commander Rashid's men brought Amina to the center of the square. They had bound her hands and attached them to a wooden post that had been erected for the purpose. A man with a heavy leather whip stood ready, his face grim as he prepared to carry out the sentence. Commander Rashid addressed the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the square. He spoke of the importance of order and discipline, of the need to respect authority and maintain security. He described Amina's brother's transgression, and explained that her punishment would serve as a lesson to anyone who might consider similar actions. As he spoke, Amina tried to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. She had heard stories of public lashings, knew that the pain could be overwhelming, and that many victims lost consciousness before the punishment was complete. She thought of Omar, hopefully being released from his cell at that very moment, and tried to find strength in the knowledge that her sacrifice would save him. The first lash fell with a crack that echoed across the square. Amina gasped but managed to stay on her feet, her jaw clenched against the burning pain that spread across her back. The crowd flinched collectively, many closing their eyes or turning away from the sight. By the 10th lash, blood was beginning to seep through her torn clothing. By the 20th, she was struggling to remain upright, her legs trembling with the effort. The man with the whip seemed to be taking no pleasure in his task, but he continued methodically, counting each stroke aloud as the crowd watched in horrified silence. Commander Rashid observed from a raised platform, his expression impassive as he watched the punishment unfold. This was justice as he understood it, necessary and inevitable, a demonstration of power that would maintain order throughout his territory. As the 30th lash fell, Amina's knees buckled and she sagged against the post, held upright only by the ropes that bound her wrists. Her vision blurred and darkened at the edges, and she fought to maintain consciousness as wave after wave of agony washed over her. The crowd grew restless, murmuring among themselves as they witnessed the brutal punishment of a young woman whose only crime was trying to save her brother. Even some of Commander Rashid's own men shifted uncomfortably, glancing between their leader and the suffering girl in the square. It was at that moment, as the 40th lash prepared to fall, that the sound of approaching horses echoed through the village. A cloud of dust appeared on the main road, growing larger as a group of mounted riders approached at speed. Commander Rashid frowned and shaded his eyes, trying to identify the newcomers. The riders were clearly military, but they flew banners that Commander Rashid did not recognize immediately. As they drew closer, he could see that they were well armed and disciplined, moving with the precision of professional soldiers rather than local militia or tribal fighters. At their head rode a man whose presence commanded immediate attention, even from a distance. He sat his horse with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and his elaborate uniform suggested high rank in whatever organization he represented. Behind him followed dozens of mounted warriors, their weapons and equipment indicating they were no ordinary patrol. As the mysterious riders entered the village square, the crowd parted to make way for them. Commander Rashid stepped down from his platform, trying to project confidence while secretly calculating whether his men could mount effective resistance if these newcomers proved hostile. The lead rider dismounted and strode forward, his eyes taking in the scene before him with obvious displeasure. He looked at Amina hanging from the post, at the man with the bloody whip, at Commander Rashid and his assembled followers. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The arrival of this unexpected force would change everything that happened next. The man who approached was unlike anyone the villagers had ever seen. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the confident bearing of a born leader. His uniform was richly decorated but practical, marking him as someone who had earned his position through merit rather than politics. Most striking were his eyes, which seemed to take in everything at once while revealing nothing of his thoughts. He identified himself as General Mahmud Khan, a regional warchief whose territory bordered Commander Rashid's domain. His reputation preceded him, known throughout the region as a fierce warrior but also as a man who governed with wisdom and justice rather than pure brutality. Unlike many local commanders, he had earned the loyalty of his people through protection and fair treatment rather than fear alone. General Khan surveyed the scene with obvious disgust. His eyes moved from Amina's bloodied form to the whip in the executioner's hand, then to Commander Rashid, who was trying to maintain his composure despite being clearly caught off guard by this unexpected intervention. The general's voice carried clearly across the square as he demanded an explanation for what he was witnessing. Commander Rashid stepped forward, attempting to project authority while explaining that he was carrying out justice against a spy who had violated the security of his compound. He described Omar's intrusion and Amina's decision to take her brother's punishment, presenting it as a necessary demonstration of his power and authority. General Khan listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each word. When Commander Rashid finished his explanation, the general was silent for a long moment, studying the faces of the crowd and the obvious reluctance with which they had gathered to witness the punishment. Then he spoke, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority. He declared that what he was witnessing was not justice but the abuse of power against innocent people. He pointed out that Omar was clearly a child who had made a harmless mistake, and that Amina's willingness to sacrifice herself for her brother demonstrated courage and love that deserved respect rather than punishment. Commander Rashid bristled at this criticism, asserting his right to govern his territory as he saw fit. He reminded the general that they were equals in rank and that interference in his affairs could be considered an act of war. His men moved closer, hands moving toward their weapons as tension filled the air. But General Khan was not intimidated. He revealed that his intervention was not random chance, but the result of reports he had received about Commander Rashid's increasingly brutal and arbitrary rule. Several families had fled Rashid's territory seeking refuge in Khan's domain, bringing stories of executions, torture, and oppression that had convinced the general that action was necessary. Moreover, Khan explained that he had been traveling to meet with other regional leaders about forming a council to bring stability to the area. Commander Rashid's reputation for unpredictable violence was making him a liability to everyone's security, driving away trade and creating refuges that hostile forces could exploit. The crowd listened in amazement as General Khan spoke of a different kind of leadership, one based on protection of the innocent rather than domination through fear. Many had never imagined that those in power could govern any other way, having lived their entire lives under various forms of harsh rule. Commander Rashid found himself in an impossible position. General Khan's force clearly outnumbered his available men, and the general's reputation meant that other local commanders would likely support him in any conflict. But backing down publicly would destroy Rashid's authority and potentially lead to uprisings throughout his territory. General Khan seemed to understand this dilemma and offered a solution that surprised everyone present. Rather than demanding immediate surrender or threatening military action, he proposed a formal challenge based on ancient traditions of honor that even Commander Rashid could not refuse without losing face completely. He called for a trial by combat, with himself representing Amina's innocence against any champion Commander Rashid chose to represent his authority. The winner would determine not only Amina's fate but also whether Commander Rashid would retain control of his territory or be forced to submit to the regional council's authority. The challenge sent murmurs through the crowd, many of whom had heard stories of such trials but had never witnessed one. Traditional law recognized such challenges as legitimate means of settling disputes when normal negotiation failed, and refusing such a challenge would mark Commander Rashid as a coward in the eyes of all who served him. Commander Rashid realized he had little choice but to accept, though he tried to buy time by demanding that the challenge take place the following day. General Khan refused, pointing out that Amina was suffering and needed immediate medical attention. The trial would take place immediately, with the entire village as witnesses. The square was hastily cleared to create a fighting circle, with weapons provided by neutral parties to ensure fairness. Commander Rashid chose his best fighter, a scarred veteran named Abdul who had never lost a single combat. The man was known throughout the region for his skill with both sword and rifle, and many expected him to make quick work of the general. But those who knew General Khan's reputation were not surprised when he chose to fight personally rather than selecting a champion. Stories of his prowess in battle were legend throughout the region, and he had never been known to ask others to take risks he was not willing to face himself. As the two men prepared for combat, village elders quickly freed Amina from the post and carried her to a nearby house where women could tend to her wounds. She drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware of the dramatic events unfolding around her, but clinging to the hope that somehow her ordeal might finally end. The fight began with both men circling each other carefully, testing their opponent's reflexes and looking for weaknesses. Abdul was younger and appeared stronger, but General Khan moved with the fluid grace of someone who had survived countless battles through skill rather than luck. Abdul struck first, his sword flashing toward the general's head in a move that would have decapitated a lesser opponent. But Khan ducked smoothly under the blade and responded with a thrust that forced Abdul to leap backward to avoid being skewered. The crowd watched in tense silence as the two warriors exchanged a series of attacks and counters, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Abdul's youth and strength seemed evenly matched against Khan's experience and tactical awareness, and the outcome remained uncertain as the minutes passed. Commander Rashid watched with growing anxiety as he realized that his champion was not dominating the fight as expected. If Abdul lost, Rashid would face not only the loss of his authority, but potentially his life as well, depending on General Khan's mercy. The turning point came when Abdul overextended himself in an aggressive attack, leaving himself briefly vulnerable. General Khan exploited the opening with lightning speed, his blade finding the gap in Abdul's defenses and delivering a wound that, while not immediately fatal, clearly marked the end of the contest. Abdul fell to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt as he acknowledged defeat. General Khan stood over him, breathing heavily but victorious, his sword clean and ready despite the exhausting duel. The crowd erupted in amazement and relief, many hardly believing that Commander Rashid's reign of terror had finally been challenged successfully. True to the terms of the challenge, General Khan claimed authority over Commander Rashid and his territory. But rather than executing his defeated rival or imposing harsh punishment, he offered terms that surprised everyone present. Rashid would be allowed to retain command of his men and a portion of his territory, but only under Khan's oversight and with strict limits on his authority. More importantly, Khan immediately ordered the release of all prisoners held by Rashid and declared amnesty for anyone who had fled the region due to harsh treatment. Omar was brought from his cell, weak and injured but alive, and reunited with his family amid tears of joy and relief. General Khan personally oversaw Amina's medical treatment, bringing his own physician to ensure she received the best care possible. Her wounds were serious but not life-threatening, and the doctor assured her family that she would recover completely with proper rest and treatment. In the days that followed, General Khan worked to establish new systems of governance based on consultation with village elders and protection of individual rights. He set up courts where disputes could be settled fairly, established markets where traders could operate safely, and created militias trained to protect rather than oppress the local population. Commander Rashid, stripped of his absolute power but allowed to retain his dignity, eventually became one of Khan's most effective subordinates. The humbling experience had taught him lessons about leadership that ultimately made him a better commander, though he never forgot the day a young woman's courage had exposed the emptiness of rule through fear alone. Amina recovered slowly from her ordeal, but the experience had changed her profoundly. She had discovered reserves of courage within herself that she had never known existed, and she had learned that even the most powerful oppressors could be challenged when justice and determination aligned with the right circumstances. General Khan, impressed by her bravery and intelligence, offered to take her into his service as an advisor on matters affecting women and families in his territory. Amina accepted, becoming one of the few women in the region to hold a position of real authority and using her influence to ensure that others would never face the kind of arbitrary justice that had nearly cost her life. Omar grew up to become the teacher he had dreamed of being, but he also carried with him the memory of his sister's sacrifice and the lesson it taught about standing up for what was right regardless of the cost. He often told his students the story of the day a young woman's love for her brother brought down a tyrant and changed their village forever. The story of Amina's courage spread throughout the region, inspiring others to stand up against injustice and proving that even the most powerless individuals could make a difference when they were willing to risk everything for what they believed in. Her willingness to face brutal punishment for an innocent brother had not only saved a life but had transformed an entire community, showing that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected sources. Years later, when people spoke of the changes that had transformed their region from a place of fear into one of hope, they always mentioned the young woman who had faced down a commander's whip and the Warchief who had recognized that true strength came from protection rather than domination. Their story became a legend that parents told their children, a reminder that courage and justice could triumph even in the darkest of times.